Well, here we are again. It's quite interesting. Sometimes just a word can encapsulate the essence of a political, social and cultural movement. Now, Mr. Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia currently, has tackled the climate emergency issue in an interesting way, a way that most other people don't really accept. But he claims, and his government claims, that we can continue the way we are. We don't have to make any major changes, and we're going to make a buck out of this. And the words that he put forward, which I assume had been looked at by his cabinet and possibly media advisors, was can-do capitalism. I'll repeat it again. Can-do capitalism. I mean, this phrase encapsulates the very essence of a Liberal National Party policy. And you wonder why a political and social movement, which is basically interested in maintaining the profits of their major sponsors, fights tooth and nail to retain its parliamentary majority. If it thinks that capitalism, private investment for private profits, is the essence of everyday existence. Now, if we look at the world historically, and especially over the last 200 years during the Industrial Revolution, we saw the consequences of can-do capitalism. The concept of allowing private investors to basically do what they like, irrespective of the human, social, environmental and cultural costs, in order to maximise profits for owners or major shareholders. Anybody has to look at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to see the abject poverty of Europeans in the very face of can-do capitalism. And what we saw over the next 200 years was an ongoing struggle between capital and labour. And that ongoing struggle led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. And that ongoing struggle was what determines the type of society we live in today in this country. The sacrifices which were made in that struggle to regulate capitalism through legislation and also challenge private investment through private profit by the establishment of state-owned facilities to provide essential services for individuals and families and societies as a whole. And it's no accident that that struggle revolved around taxation, tax reform, in order to derive the assets necessary to provide universal free education, to provide access to healthcare, to provide access to the financial sector through a government-owned bank, the Commonwealth Bank in this country, to provide essential access to essential infrastructure, including energy sources like electricity and gas. So that struggle spanned almost 200 years, and we saw an improvement in people's lives and life expectancy, not because of can do capitalism, giving private investors for private profit their heads, but by regulating private investment for private profit, by establishing competitive forces within society, forces like the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory in this country, the Commonwealth Bank, Qantas, and many other state-owned telecommunications through Telecom, and the list goes on and on. So to revert back to the idea that it's people who have access to capital who can provide the solutions to the ongoing problems which are faced by society is an utter illusion. It's a total illusion. What we have in 2021 and what we will have in May 2022, when the next federal election is called, we will have political parties who in the main are hostages to private investors. Political party who need funds in order to launch a credible campaign in essential marginal seats in this country in order to win government. And what does the prize of winning government means? The prize of winning government means that the deregulation, privatisation, corporatisation and globalisation agenda, which has dominated economic activity in this country and around the world for the last 40 to 50 years, will continue to dominate economic activity. Now, we are constantly told that when you have capitalist modes of production, the wealth trickles down to everybody. That everybody's life expectancy improves, that everybody's lifestyle improves, that everybody's options improve. The reality is grossly different. It doesn't matter how much profit is made for the exploitation of labour and for the exploitation of resources in this country. What matters is how that profit is distributed and what is the legislative framework which distributes that profit. And what we've seen in the last 4 to 5 decades is a concerted effort to rescind legislation which was put in place to protect people from the ethical and moral abyss that the concept of private investment for private profit highlights. Because private investment for private profit has some logical consequences. One logical consequence is the formation of corporations. What happens? You don't have a deregulated marketplace. What you have is a regulated marketplace, a marketplace which is regulated for the big players who dominate the small players and absorb them or bankrupt them. And that's why in this country and around the world you may have 2, 3, 4 firms which dominate various aspects of human activity. So capitalism leads not to competition, but leads to corporatisation. The big phase over the last 20 years before COVID-19 brought an abrupt halt was globalisation. And globalisation is a simple concept. It's about using the world's labour resources, the cheapest labour resources, to produce products which come back into this country which are then on-sold. And it's no accident that unemployment for a significant portion of the population, especially people who are unskilled or semi-skilled, has become such an issue. So how does a private investment for private profit, a can-do capitalism, resolve the issue of organised labour and resolve the issue of increasing wages in this country. And it does it in two ways. The first way, and the most significant way, is to criminalise trade union activity through legislation. And in 2021, a member of the Construction, Forestry, Mining, Maritime and Energy Union has less legal rights than a drug dealer or a drug importer who imports $1 billion of drugs into this country. The drug dealer has the right to maintain silence. The member of the CFMMEU does not have a right to silence. Then we have legislation which reduces the withdrawal of persons' labour to a specific period within an enterprise bargaining agreement period, where various aspects of this country's manufacturing and financial sectors and retail sectors negotiate with workers. But they negotiate from a power of absolute strength because the worker is not able to remove their labour except during this short period of time. And if they do remove their labour, what happens is they can be fined individually $10,000 a day, and the organisations which represent them can be bankrupted. So, like communist states, a state which is based on the concept of private investment, can-do capitalism, does everything in its power through legislation to stymie any attempt by workers to collectively bargain to improve their conditions. The second thing which happens regularly in this country, especially at the federal level, is electoral legislation which is designed to reduce competition during an election campaign. And that legislation ranges from the ability of groups to raise funds in order to promote a particular political ideological position. And what we see is large corporations giving money to the Liberal National Party in order for the Liberal National Party to continue to promote the concept of can-do capitalism. And this money is then used for advertising during election campaigns. But it's a little bit more complex than this. We have legislation in place which makes it almost impossible for independent and small political parties to have any impact in a federal election. The way the Senate paper is drawn up, the fact that if you're an independent and you team up with another person, you can have a box above the line, but you're not allowed to have the word independent next to that box, so people think it's some type of misprint. That if there's only one candidate, you cannot have a box above the line and people have to mark every box below the line. Then there's the financial disincentive, where the cost of running continues to escalate. And finally, you change the rules in terms of registered political party, in terms of membership numbers, which have been recently increased from 500 to 1,500. So there are all these hurdles which are put in place put in the road of alternative political voices in this country. And we see this happen consistently. A third way that you can derail any opposition, especially in Australia, is the introduction of draconian legislation which is based on the ability of governments, because of a lack of constitutional recognition of individual rights, a lack of a recognition that the individual needs protection from the arbitrary exercise of state power. We see legislation which is put in place which allows the Home Affairs Minister to ban any political party he or she likes because they may at some stage pose a threat, and that means an economic threat as well as a physical threat to the current order. We have legislation which allows individuals to be secretly arrested and held for up to 10 days to be questioned. And if they don't answer questions, like members of the CFMEU, they can be jailed for up to 7 years. So because of a lack of constitutional rights in the Australian Constitution, the state basically, as we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, not just at the state level but the federal level, can pass legislation which can restrict freedoms which people assumed they have, including the freedom of speech. Because the High Court of Australia has found that freedom of speech does not exist in this country as a right. It can only exist during an election campaign because you need different political groups to be able to articulate those ideas during that campaign. As far as the Constitution is concerned, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, these are all freedoms which are not contained within the Australian Constitution for one very important reason. The Australian Constitution is basically a document which regulates the interaction between the Federation of States and the central government, the federal government. So there are many hurdles which are put in place to ensure can-do capitalism continues to prosper. Another hurdle which is put in place, well, it's actually not a hurdle but actually a carrot which is put in the face of that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and that 8% of Australians who has disposable income which they can invest in the stock market and housing, is the passage of legislation which allows individuals and corporations to mine our natural resources while returning a peppercorn rent to the people of this country. If you look at the mining sector, it only employs 2% of the country's population. But as far as the profits that are derived from that sector, those profits don't go back to the community through the taxation system. They go back to private corporations and individuals. No wonder one of the fastest growing numbers in this country are billionaires and millionaires. And the thing about private investment for private profit is there is no moral, there is no ethical dimensions to what can and cannot be done. And if you think can-do capitalism is going to solve the climate emergency, the very system of production, the very economic system which created the current climate emergency is going to solve it is ludicrous. And what's happened in Glasgow, highlights how difficult it is for sovereign nation states who are dependent on private investment for private profit, whether they call themselves communist or capitalist, how difficult it is to wean themselves off energy sources like coal and gas, which are so detrimental to the future of this planet. So there are many, many hurdles which are put in place. And the thing is, we can accept these hurdles or we can struggle against these hurdles. It's quite interesting the number of people who have been mobilised regarding COVID-19 restrictions. And these are health restrictions which were put in place in the majority of cases to ensure there were fewer deaths and sickness, and the hospital system was able to cope with the number of infections. And it's interesting to see how many people have been mobilised by COVID-19, somehow thinking they have an individual right to infect other people. As I've said before, the most important individual right is the right to life. the right to movement, association, speech, all come after the right to life. But more importantly, why is it that so many people can be mobilised on this issue while so few people can be mobilised in terms of the type of economic system we have? Why so many people support the concept of can-do capitalism? Why so many people think there is no other way? Obviously, there are a number of economic systems which have been tried over centuries. There's private investment for private profit. There's what's called state capitalism, and the state owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. There's societies which are based on mutual aid, collectives and cooperatives, and societies which are based on a mixed economy where you have cooperatives and collectives, you have mutual aid, you have state-owned enterprises and you have private-owned enterprises. The difference today in Australia is that this is a society where the major economic impetus is private investment for private profit, which has led to corporatisation, globalisation, privatisation and deregulation. That is the issue that we face today. That is the issue so few people are able to grasp and are willing to struggle against. Because if you want to deal with growing inequality, social dislocation, disillusionment and cynicism, we need to deal with this issue. This issue should be front and centre. How we produce things, who we produce them for, how wealth is created, how wealth is distributed, determines to a significant degree what type of society we are and we are not. To allow one economic form, can-do capitalism, private investment, to dominate economic activity, cultural activity, social activity, environmental activity in this country is a recipe for disaster. If you are concerned about these issues, I recommend you look at the public interest before corporate interest website, pibci.net, pibci.net. Have a look at it. If you're interested, download the application form and join us. If we are not able to mobilise people around these issues, not just us, but other people in our community who are fighting the same battle, then nothing will change. Inequality will increase, disillusionment will increase, social dislocation will increase, and most importantly of all, the climate emergency will be irreversible.